More now on the bipartisan Senate investigation of the January 6th Capitol insurrection that highlights the intelligence and personnel failures leading up to and during the attack. The report details how ill-equipped and underprepared the Capitol Police Force was while defending the building and the people inside of it. For example, according to the report, of the 7 civil disturbance units deployed, only 4 had the protective equipment needed, some of which was locked in a bus. There is this line from the report, quote, "An officer reported hearing a lieutenant repeatedly ask over the radio, 'Does anybody have a plan?' The probe also found neither the FBI nor DHS issued a threat assessment warning of potential violence targeting the Capitol that day." Joining us now, the chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. His committee was one of 2 that released that report. Senator, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Before we dig into the report, I just want to take one step back and talk about what this investigation is and what it is not. There's been a lot of talk that it doesn't talk about President Trump. It doesn't talk about all that led up to January 6th. So what was the scope of your investigation as you set out to take it on?
Well, I think it's a very important question, and to be clear, it is a limited scope, and that was the intent right from the beginning, was to look at exactly what happened in terms of the attack that day, how the security presence was deployed, where there were gaps, talk about the intelligence, understanding better why it took so long for the National Guard to respond. It was simply to take a look at that, and the reason for that was that we knew that we had to get recommendations out as quickly as possible that would help safeguard the Capitol to make sure that another attack like what we saw on January 6th would not be successful in breaching the Capitol. And we wanted to get those recommendations out quickly, and that's why it's the limited scope. But clearly, there are a number of other questions that we have. We need to have answers. The American people need to have answers. That's why I was so disappointed that we weren't able to get a commission through the Senate in a bipartisan way to do a deep dive into what inspired those folks to come and engage in an insurrection on the Capitol. It's clear to me it was an insurrection, and we need to fully investigate that and get a better sense of what's happening in regards to that. But this particular report, this is the Rules Committee that oversees Capitol Police. It's my committee, Homeland Security, with the Department of Homeland Security, Intelligence, and looking at the National Guard, was to help those officers. And I want to be clear, the men and women of the Capitol Police, the frontline officers, were heroic that day. And so many of them have pulled me aside as we've been working on this and said, Senator, you know, the leadership let us down. Don't let this ever happen again. And that's really the focus of the report.
Can't make that point strongly enough about the heroism of those officers let down without a plan. Reports are, Senator, that the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security were not cooperative in your investigation. In fact, that you didn't even hear back from the House Sergeant at Arms. Number one, is that true? And number 2, why not?
Well, it's the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have been cooperative, but not sufficiently cooperative. So we need to get more information from them, particularly from the intelligence failure. And it's something that my committee will continue to investigate, although we put out this report yesterday. That part of the investigation is not over. We saw significant gaps. There wasn't a formal intelligence warning that was put out to let local law enforcement know what they might be confronting that day. That's simply unacceptable. And it's particularly unacceptable because we all saw it coming. It was on social media. It was pretty clear what we were seeing on social media, that people were going to come. We had the president himself say it's going to be wild. We knew folks were coming here. And yet we heard back from both FBI and DHS that they weren't sure what was a credible claim versus First Amendment speech. That makes no sense to me. Why didn't they think what they were seeing on social media as being credible? Clearly it was, because it manifested itself in a dramatic and horrible fashion on January 6th. But we want to know what they knew and when they knew it and who did they communicate it to or not communicate it to. we're still waiting for that information, and we're going to continue to aggressively pursue it.
So having conducted these interviews and looked at all this evidence, Senator, what is your read on why the Capitol Police were not better prepared? In your report, you cite, I think December 21st was the date when there was talk about weapons being brought to the Capitol, that this was going to be much more than a political rally, that it could be much worse. And of course, tragically, it was. So why, with that space of a couple of weeks, why was security not beefed up?
Well, and it wasn't, and there wasn't a formal wording, but there, as I said, there was a lot of information out there that you should be very concerned, and yet we did not see that actually play out in the preparations. In fact, what was really striking to me, among many things, was that when we asked the Capitol Police leadership, could you tell us where your officers were deployed on that day at the beginning as the rally was coming to the Capitol? They couldn't tell us where their officers were deployed. At least they couldn't provide any information. That tells me there's definitely wasn't a plan put in place to do that. But if you look at the longer systemic issues, too, is the lack of training. Most of the officers that were out there, they have had civil disturbance training, but it was probably back when they just first became officers in their academy. They hadn't had any kind of refreshers of how to deal with a violent mob coming at them. They certainly weren't equipped. You see from those images that most of those folks, they didn't have riot gear on. They didn't. Those are only select units that have it, and not all of them had that gear. So they're out there basically in their uniforms without training, current training, with people with fire extinguishers and beating them with flag posts. It was a horrible situation for them to be in, and we've got to correct that. We've got to make sure they have all of the equipment that they need in the future. We have to make sure that they have the training. And we have to make sure there are comprehensive plans and that they actually exercise those plans and can be able to pull them off quickly. And that includes the National Guard, is to make sure that there are operational plans ready to go if another incident like this were to occur, because it simply can't happen again. We can never let this happen again.
Senator, hey, it's Sam Stein here. I know this was not your purview. The purview was limited to law enforcement, but I'm curious. Two things. One is, if there's one question that you would ask that you feel like we do not have a sufficient answer for, what is it? And then two, do you harbor any suspicions that sitting lawmakers may have played a role in either bringing people to the event or giving people some sort of outlay of the Congress and Capitol building complexes?
Well, I don't. I hope that's not the case, and I want to act on facts. I think we got to be very careful to make sure that that this is all done based on facts. That's what we were very careful in this report, is that it was fact-based and try to have a real wide-eyed, open view of those facts. So I'm going to continue to operate on that basis. But I think those are questions that we need to ask and that we need to try to seek out answers, because it is important for us to better understand that. But I also think we have to better understand what's going on in our country and the polarization and the fact, in fact, I saw earlier the reports of folks that are worried about our democracy. It is very real. I'm very concerned about the future for this country and the vibrancy of our democracy, and folks who want to undermine that. We have to have an understanding of that, and we all have to come together as a country and understand that people who know better have to stop furthering and fostering this kind of behavior from individuals. And that is something that we have to come to terms with as a country, which is why a commission, further investigations are absolutely essential. And I'm really frustrated if I hear people think the report we did, well, that's it, let's move on. That's never been what we intended with this report. This is about immediate recommendations to help those men and women who are on the front line. It's an important step. I think it's a meaningful step. But it's not the only step we need to take. We have to take a whole lot of other steps, and we need to do it as quickly as we can.
So let's talk about what those other steps are. If you look at the Morning Consult Politico polling, 77% of voters think America's democracy is currently being threatened in some way, shape, or form. I mean, these numbers are terrible. There are people in America who believe what you believe and saw what you saw and see it the same way you do, because there's one way to see it. It was an insurrection, an attack on our democracy. But when is the country going to get the validation it needs that we are a democracy? And this was an attack on it from within. What exactly needs to happen to get lawmakers in Washington on the same page with this?
Well, because you're absolutely right, and we have to, and certainly the big lies about how you undermine democracies. We see a template of how democracies are undermined, and we've seen it in other countries. And if you look at the backsliding with democracies around the world, it's not from foreign threats, it's from within. It's the corrosive powers from within those democracies. And when you think about one of the fundamental ways that democracies have failed around the world, it's because there's an attempt to undermine the credibility of elections, to saying elections don't matter. And if elections don't matter, that's where an authoritarian can walk in and say, I represent the people, and the elections don't matter because they're fraudulent. It's right out of a playbook of what happens. We need to learn from the experiences around the country. And we all have to come together as Democrats and Republicans and as the American people to understand how this country can deteriorate if we are not careful. And, I'm struck by George Washington's farewell address. And I was asked a few years ago to read George Washington's farewell address on the Senate floor. And I was struck. Here he is leaving the presidency, a rock star of all rock stars. They said, George, you can't leave. We'll make you king. Don't leave. And he said, no, I fought the king. And I'm going to leave. And in this address, he talks about how his concerns about this new young republic. He said, I'm really concerned about factions rising. I'm afraid that folks will retreat into these factions and be focused on their own self-interest and on their own power. And when that happens, a demagogue will rise up, and that is when this young democracy will fail. Those are pretty powerful words by one of the founders of our country. And we are in that moment right now. And we have to look at this with clear eyes. We have to lean in, and we have to make sure that we stand up to those corrosive forces that are happening.